Hello there, you scrublords, and welcome to the first of 3 videos dedicated to the gun tank concept. This first episode will focus primarily on what it is, where it came from, and why it happened. The second episode will focus mainly on the US developments, and then the final episode will focus on the British developments. So without further ado, let's begin. To start, we have to go back to the end of the Second World War. The Western Allies, primarily Britain and the United States, had been experimenting with newer generation tank designs to counter late-war German armor. The US had deployed a limited number of Pershing tanks as part of the Z plan, and a single super variant armed with an even longer-barreled T-15E1 90mm gun loading 2-piece ammunition. The British, meanwhile, were putting their finishing touches on their Centurion Mark I, and were preparing to deploy it to the Western Front. While the Centurion did not see active combat during that conflict, British designers were also beginning work on the idea of a universal tank design that will replace both the cruiser tanks like Comet and the infantry tanks like Churchill. This would culminate in 1946 with the development of the FV-221 Carnarvon. The US would also pursue new tank designs such as the powerful T-29 and T-30 in 1944 and 45, and T-32 and T-34 heavy tanks in the late 40s, which were all adaptations of the T-26 chassis. These experiments will lay the foundation for what is to come. Now, as the end of the war with Germany grew closer and closer, the Allies were becoming increasingly concerned with how the post-war situation would work out in regards to the advancing Red Army. And with the end of the war in Europe in early May 1945, the Soviets proposed that everyone celebrate with a friendly display of military might in a victory parade set for September 7th of that year. Now, while quite a few units took part in that parade from Britain, France, the US, and the Soviets, what we care about today is the presence of the Soviet 2nd Guards Tank Army, which were the last armored unit to pass through the parade route. What the West saw rolling down that road was what they perceived as one of the greatest threats to the free world that they had seen yet. I am speaking of none other than 52 IS-3 heavy tanks, which presented the Allies with the frightening idea that all their current service tank designs were now rendered completely obsolescent by this new, what they perceived to be a super tank. So great were the Allied generals concerned that it's reported General George S. Patton leaned over to one of the Soviet staff and whispered in his ear, "You know we're still on the same side, right?" Now, whether or not this is true, I do not know for sure, as I haven't been able to confirm this with any real primary source documentation, but it adds flavor and makes a good story, so what the hell. In the aftermath of the Berlin Parade, the Western Allies scrambled to develop vehicles specifically designed to defeat the IS-3 in event of war. The US took stock of what it had and decided to organize the US next generation of tanks into 3 vehicle types. The T-41 would be the light tank that would develop into the M41 Little Bulldog, which was renamed Walker Bulldog after the late General Walker, who died in a Jeep accident in 1950. The T-42 would become the standard medium tank to replace the M26 and M46s and leftover M4 Shermans from World War II production, and would develop into the M47 Patton II. The final member of the family would be the T-43, which, as you might guess, would be the future heavy tank of the Army, and would develop into the M103. As for the British, they took a look at the current vehicles in service, and decided to adopt 3 new families of vehicles as well. The FV-100 series would have included tanks in the 80 to 100 ton range, the FV-200s at 60 to 80 tons, and the FV-300 series at 40 tons. To quote the tank historian Nicholas Moran, "Shortly after they came up with this brilliant idea, an attack of sanity happened, and they quickly ditched the FV-100 series." End quote. The FV-200 series were next on the chopping block when the Soviets unveiled their IS-3 at the victory parade discussed earlier. As a result, the British took a second look at their FV-2114 that was in testing, and decided to put it in production to be named Conqueror. I won't say any more about the M103 and the Conqueror, as I would like to save that information for future episodes. Now that we know the gist of where these vehicles came from and why they developed into the vehicles they did, now let's answer the question of what is a gun tank. In theory, a heavy gun tank's role on the battlefield would be to counter heavily armored targets and threats from the greatest effective range possible while delivering effective armor protection in a very powerful gun package. This is all just a fancy way of saying, oh my god, please nerf the IS-3 in real life. Now, what the Western Allies didn't realize at the time was that the IS-3 was actually a really, really poorly designed tank, It had many issues, and shortly after they were introduced into service, they were all sent back to the factories for a complete rebuilding program, and they became the IS-3M. But the Allies didn't know that, so whatever. However, the Western Allies tanks didn't really catch on very well either, for quite a number of reasons. The M103, as we will discuss more in its development episode, didn't maintain the enthusiasm and support of the Army as the development program dragged on and on and on. This more had to do with the Army wanting to focus on the development of 90mm gun tank M48, and its more promising heat ammunition which could penetrate over 16 inches of steel armor, which, while not as good as the M103's shaped charge ammunition, allowed the Army to cling to the idea that the 90mm gun was more than good enough to take on all comers as they saw fit. Indeed, the only reason why the M103 was built was because of a requirement by the US Marine Corps to have a heavy tank to carry an amphibious invasion inland after an initial beach landing. As a result, 220 of the 300 M103s built would end up in the Marine Corps, with a few remaining Army tanks later being replaced by M48s and M60s. Meanwhile, in Britain, the Conqueror had run into several problems which will be detailed in its own episode. This led to a small number being rebuilt into Conqueror Mark II standards by reusing a few leftover Carnarvon hulls. Other than these few vehicles, there were less than 10 Mark IIs ever made, the rest of the Mark I Conquerors carried on in service with continuing problems. Meanwhile, the British Royal Ordnance Factory, under the control of the British Ministry of Supply, had developed a brand new 105mm L52 tank gun known as the L7. This gun became the most successful tank gun that Britain ever produced, and it became the standard tank gun of NATO until the adoption of the Rheinmetall 120mm smoothbore. This gun, while not as purely devastating as the L1A1 mounted on the Conqueror, was specifically designed to fit the mountings of the 20-pounder tank gun then mounted on the Centurions. The incredible performance of this gun meant that Centurions could now take on the vehicles that Conqueror was originally built to destroy. The gun was also far cheaper and far easier to produce than entirely new Conqueror tanks, yet delivered sufficient performance to render the Conqueror redundant. As a result, when it came time to replace the Centurions with the new Chieftain main battle tank, the Conqueror was also retired and many became static targets, with few surviving examples today. And that will do the first episode of the gun tank concept. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Do you guys want to see the second episode or the third episode? Or will this be the only one? It's up to you guys. Without further ado, this has been Many Miles Away. Keep your tracks checked, keep your binos in place, keep around in the tube, and I will see you guys in the next one.